Hello, everybody, and welcome to Life's a Breach. Today, we are going to be talking about ransomware and beyond with some of our fantastic Lacework Labs researchers. Before we get rolling into the meat of the discussion, just a little bit of a housekeeping. We are live here on LinkedIn. If you haven't been a part of a LinkedIn Live before, you can comment in the chat. We're going to see that. We'll give you a little bit of shout out. If you have questions, you can raise them there. If you're watching this on demand, that's awesome, fantastic. These streams go up like a normal video post after the live stream has ended. You can still comment there. We actively monitor our social channels. If you have questions, if you have comments, if you have suggestions about what you want to see us talking about, if who you want to see us talking to. My name is Mark Nunnikhoven. I'm a cloud strategist here at Lacework. We obviously are the data security platform for the cloud. And most of our streams are going to be centered around building in the cloud, about modernizing your security practice, about leveraging data to move forward, and really anything that affects security as we all work to modernize to meet business needs. That being said, I'm a nerd at heart. I love digging into really cool and interesting things. Anytime I have a chance to talk to people like our guests today, I'm super excited. I love to geek out on this kind of stuff. We're going to be diving in to the predictions from our labs team. So we do have today Chris Hall and Greg Foss, who we'll bring up in just a second. What I want to give you is just a quick little brief overview of Lacework Labs. So they are our research team. If you haven't heard of them, you are absolutely missing out. If you go to lacework.com/blog, you're going to see a ton of their stuff there, interwoven with some of the other content that we put out as a company. But you'll see a great amount of the research that the team does. They're also active on social individually and as a team. You should absolutely be following them over on Twitter, as well as on the blog to keep up with the latest research. They're regularly publishing deep dives into issues that they've discovered through their research that will help you build a better security practice, that will help increase your security knowledge. Also, they publish a regular cloud threat report. So they've done 2 volumes already. You can catch that over on the blog as well. That gives you a better overview and help you kind of navigate the volume, just the sheer volume of content that the team is putting out. So check that out, Lacework Labs, absolutely fantastic source of cloud security knowledge. And with that, we're going to bring up Chris Hall and Greg Foss onto the screen here, and we're going to get diving into this. So gentlemen, thanks for joining. I'll give you a sec to introduce yourselves. Greg, do you want to go first?
Oh, sure. Thanks so much, Mark. Hey, everyone. I'm Greg Foss. I'm a security researcher here on the Lacework Labs team.
And Chris?
Hey, everybody. I'm Chris Hall, and same as Greg, researcher with Lacework Labs.
Right on. Thanks. Okay, so predictions. It's a tradition within the security community to kind of look back and then look forward and extrapolate and say, okay, based on what we know, based on what we feel, based on our expertise, here's what we think we're going to see in the coming year. Some, depending on when you look out there, some predictions are super safe and they're just a tiny extrapolation forward. Some people go absolutely crazy and go right off the deep edge. You guys both have a vast amount of experience in cybersecurity, in cloud security as well. So we're going to dive into your predictions, and I think the audience is going to get a lot out of this. And as a reminder, for you tuning in live, by all means, jump in the comments, ask away, ask your questions, let us know what your reactions are to this. But what we're going to do is we're going to kick off with Greg. Greg, what's your first prediction for 2022?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So the first prediction we wanted to highlight was kind of an extrapolation of what we've seen within Linux and just cloud infrastructure in general. And as these infrastructures becoming more emerging targets for malware and even ransomware attacks. So, some of the trends we've been following around threat actors looking just generally for the path of least resistance. And a lot of that means, getting into these cloud infrastructures through compromising web infrastructure and things of that nature, and then leveraging this newfound access in a means that's kind of going to be give them the most return on their investment. So most commonly what we're seeing is crypto mining. That's something where a majority of, when you ask anyone about cloud security threats, they're going to mention crypto miners as the big thing. So of course, that's a large aspect of what we're following. A lot of these crimeware groups and And that's the big thing they say about, cloud infrastructure and crypto mining. It's only profitable if you're mining on someone else's infrastructure. So that's kind of the tactic they take here. But extending on that, it is all about infrastructure and leveraging this compromised infrastructure as a means to pivot and use that in more additional aspects of their attacks. So that's the big thing we're seeing is like people taking over targets for sending spam and leveraging these as pivot points into organizations and performing other targeted attacks. And so that's a big aspect of kind of just what we've been following. But I think malware in general is going to start targeting Linux a lot more. I know, Chris has worked on a lot of real interesting samples specifically around advanced Linux malware. And, now with about 80% of cloud infrastructure being made up of Linux systems, we think this threat is only going to increase. And one example I wanted to point to was that our team found out that the Pisa ransomware gang recently did add Linux support to their ransomware attack playbooks. So I think, it's only a matter of time before we see them really pivot more into cloud and leveraging cloud infrastructure as a whole for their attacks.
Okay, so I mean, you raised a couple really, really interesting points there. So, with the predominant compute platform in cloud being Linux, makes sense that cyber criminals are moving over to target that because that's what's available, right? That's where the data is that they're interested in. That's the resources there. But that really stuck out, that comment you made as far as crypto mining, because I know a lot of people kind of go, well, like, how is that profitable? But the point you made about, if you're doing it on somebody else's dime, it becomes immensely profitable when you don't have any overhead. Are we seeing that frequently, or is that just, someone found it once, and so that's the example that always comes up? Like, how big of a deal is that crypto mining? Can you walk us through sort of how that actually happens?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's extremely common. We've seen them even deploying their own compromised containers. They contain their crypto miners built in, so people will deploy this software and right away it's mining in the background. And the big thing is this can be extremely costly for the victims of these attacks. Someone gets in and they're deploying crypto miners across your organization. That adds up real quickly. And it can actually be rather profitable for the attackers themselves. So we've seen a lot of different variations in the types of attacks and the way they pull off this sort of tradecraft. But it is something, every time we take a look at some of these new samples, they've added new bits and pieces and taken new shared code from other actors. And a lot of them are even imitating other actors and trying to use their watermarking and other kind of things to have us go down a different path as well.
I think that's really interesting what you're saying there as far as the borrowing from each other and mimicking each other and sort of learning from each other, and as much as we're trying to do that on the defense side, it's important to understand that the cyber criminals are doing the exact same thing because, there's more than enough to go around as far as victims and the ability to profit. But one thing, before we jump into Chris's prediction, there's one thing that you said that I really kind of want to drill in on a little bit. So you said they were rolling their own images, their own container images that have their crypto mining stuff pre-installed. So I have to assume that that image still actually works. It still does whatever I, as a builder, was trying to get it to do. Is that the case, or is it actually like something else where they're maliciously just inserting and running something we don't know about?
No, exactly. I mean, that's the way they kind of leave it in hiding, in plain sight. So you are running this software that appears to be doing this one legitimate thing, but in the background, it's also doing this additional thing. And that's kind of that big tactic we've seen, which leads into a later prediction that we'll get into in a few here. But that is something we definitely believe that's going to only increase in the coming year.
Okay. All right. So we've got cyber criminals moving on to, switching away from predominantly where in on-premise environments, it was always Windows, Windows, Windows. Now they're seeing us move to Linux, Linux, Linux. And so they're coming along. They're using our resources to mine cryptocurrency to directly profit from. They're adapting to the cloud as much as our businesses are. Okay. Makes sense. We need to be aware of that. That's going to only increase in 2022. So as a defender, as somebody in a security practice, we need to keep that in mind and adjust our techniques and our priorities accordingly, knowing that that's only going to get more severe. Chris, what are you seeing? What's your first prediction for 2022?
Thanks, Mark. So another prediction we'd like to highlight is what we believe is that we believe there will be an uptick in insider threat activities. And when we say insider threat, of course, we mean anyone with inside knowledge about a company's data or processes. So current employees, former employees, contractors, etc. And one interesting thing we've seen over the past year is hackers actually targeting employees directly or via posts on various hacking forums. So in an effort to recruit them as affiliates, essentially, for insider efforts. And in a lot of the cases, these are actually pretty high dollar offers. So I believe we've seen as much as like 90% of the proceeds, from a ransomware event going to the affiliate or the insider. So this is definitely high enough to entice, an employee who might be inclined to install ransomware, on their employees' network. And given this, as well as the trend we've seen during the pandemic of mass resignations, so it's the Great Resignation, as they call it, especially in the technology sector. I think it's pretty safe to say that, more people are probably disgruntled now than they have been in a really long time. So, what we might be looking at is a perfect storm of insider threats. And another thing that might be worth underscoring is the fact that employees can pose more of a threat to an organization than pretty much any, cyber criminal or even a nation state actor could ever hope to. Reason for this is that there's already a trust relationship and privileged access in some cases, right? So these are things that, of course, are highly prized by outside threats, and employees already have them by default. So that said, this is something that should really be, on your radar, regardless of the current trend.
Okay, I just want to circle back on that for a second, because I don't know if it jumped out at the audience as much as it did me. And as we're referencing the audience, just a reminder: if you have a question on the stream, drop in the chat. We'd be happy to dive in. But it seemed that your point there was that we're already seeing where the part of the insider threat is that cyber criminals are actively recruiting and then cutting in the employees on the profits of the crime. So it's not just I'm going to pay you one time, but like I'm going to pay you a percentage of whatever we haul in. Is that true?
Yep. So per machine. So we've seen anywhere like between 75 and 90% of the ransomware proceeds per machine going back to the affiliates, which in some cases are the insiders.
Wow. Okay. And given the prevalence of ransomware, I think everybody in the audience has seen it. It's been major headlines nonstop for the last few months. It's gained, administrative level attention, international coalition to try to address ransomware. And we know there's a ton of money being made. And it makes a sick sort of sense that there's a profit angle for people who aren't, maybe as strongly guided by a moral compass. And as you said, they have privileges already, right? They're trusted by the organization to do some level of work, which seems to me that it cuts out the sort of enumeration and discovery phase of an attack, because as long as I've discovered you, an employee, you already know the systems better than I would from the outside.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay. Normally with insider threats, I'm always like, yeah, okay, it's an HR problem. And I think it is, you need to treat your employees, you need to have a good culture. But I think your point about the big push for resignation, everybody's reevaluating the pandemic. But more importantly, just the pure cash bottom line of the amount you're talking. It's a whole new ballgame, right? With that, let's transition in back to Greg here. Greg, so we've talked Linux malware, cloud infrastructure being targeted. Chris just summed up, with the latest around insider threats and what we can expect to see. What's your next prediction for us?
So the big next prediction I wanted to touch on was that nation-state attackers will continue to target the security community directly. This is one that is kind of funny for us. We actually put this prediction down on paper, and we're talking about this, and then a week later, the whole issue about the Ghidra backdoored software came out, where nation state adversary had essentially backdoored Ghidra and was targeted getting a lot of security researchers to install this software. And or not Ghidra, it was
IDA
Pro. Mixing up my tools here. So IDA Pro, as we all know, is rather expensive. So that was kind of a key means of them to target these individuals, because a lot of people don't work for companies that will pay for a license for that. And so essentially, giving them this for free, a lot of researchers took them up on that. And then eventually it was found out that had a backdoor built into it. And who knows what that could be used for, right? Like, are they going after 0 days that these individuals might be working on? Would it just be something used for espionage and general monitoring of their computers? Maybe a means for them to get into their organizations that they work for. There's a lot of reasons for this, and it's definitely not the first time this has happened. We've seen this in the past. Google did a lot of good research around some targeted attacks that happened over Twitter that were targeting the security community. And so this is one area where, given the sophistication and some of the creativity we've seen across a lot of these nation state groups, we only see this increasing in different means that they might leverage to gain access to security researchers and security practitioners directly.
Yeah, and I think that's, obviously personally for the folks, on here, we're obviously very concerned that we're now major targets. But I think, this even links to what Chris was talking about as far as the insider threat, right? Where insiders know the systems and have privileged access. Research teams, not only is it the 0 days, but they're often consulted because you're experts in the field, right? So it's a great way for criminals to get a beat on, like, hey, are they onto me? What are they looking at? What's the focus on? Which is interesting that we're seeing that sort of very specific set of targeting as far as a community that doesn't seem to have a direct profit motive, right? Whereas we know where we see criminals going after specific verticals because they know they're likely to pay for the ransom, or they go after specific other ones because they know the IP that those companies have. This class of researchers as an attack space or a target, that's really, really fascinating. And then that clever backdooring IDA, it's really interesting as far as that, that's a very commonly accepted, well-used tool in the research community to pull things apart. So planning your stuff there, it shows that even security experts aren't immune to operational security challenges. It's a good reminder for all of us to extra strong sandboxes around stuff and verify, because it's we're workers like anybody else, right? We have stuff that we need to do and we're trying to get our job done. But if there's a threat actor who's directly targeting us, you can see that benefit. And the interesting thing that said, is that you said this wasn't cyber criminals but nation states. So do you think that angles towards the motivation at all, or maybe the resources required to pull this kind of thing off?
Yeah, completely. I think the nation state aspect of this, changes the whole playing field. Because a lot of cyber criminal groups, their main motive is going to be profit, and to just try and make money through any means available. But these nation state adversaries, they have a whole different angle. Unless we're talking about some of the nation state groups that do cybercrime for profit. But generally, it's going to be more monitoring, more passively trying to understand the infrastructure and what this individual is doing. And you touched on a really good point, Mark. About them watching to see, is this security team onto me? Do they know that maybe I'm in this network or something? And that's something that a lot of us who've done forensics in the past have seen. Specifically targeting of the internal security research team at companies as a means of, watching their communications, watching email traffic. And, at the end of the day, a lot of us like to give a hard time to people that fall for phishing attacks and stuff. But the reality of it is any one of us could be phished given the right pretext, the right context. It's not something that I feel highlights someone's misunderstanding or anything like that. I think it's just, you put the right resources behind attack, and you could get a lot of people that all of us know to click on a lot of things. So it's kind of scary, especially when you look at some of these nation state groups.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. There has been that theme for a long time of blaming users for actions, which is unfortunate. Because you have to remember that whether it's a nation state or cyber criminal organization, they're out for it to get you, and they are well resourced, and this is their sole focus. And they test this stuff out, right? And they make sure that it's well targeted, and will convert for them, right? You can think of sort of on the cyber criminal side, that phishing arm is almost like the most advanced digital marketing organization out there, right? Where, okay, we sent out this, it didn't work, we'll try this, we'll try that, and they just keep improving. I know I got one attempted fish a couple weeks ago that was so uncannily well written. I almost fell for it, caught it at the last minute. So I was like, this is just one little thing tweaked me, but almost had me. And I felt bad initially, but then wait a minute, like, they're obviously targeting, and they are well resourced in trying to do that. So it's a great point. I'm glad you brought that up. So with that, we're gonna pivot back to Chris. Chris, you got one more prediction for us? Well, what are we thinking?
Yep. So for 2022, I think we can confidently say that we will continue to see both more cryptojacking techniques, just to build off of what Craig mentioned, as well as those involving initial access brokerage, or IAB, also known as just simply selling initial access to the cloud environment. And the reason for this is these are really only the two primary methods of monetization. And of course, as is the case with many things, cloud attacks are often financially motivated. So that's just the reality. And between these two monetization categories, you have direct and indirect. So the direct one being cryptojacking for the purposes, of course, for mining on infrastructure. The key thing, as you pointed out, being infrastructure that you don't pay for. And then indirectly by way of IAB, or the initial access brokerage, or selling access to a compromised cloud infrastructure. And both of these have pros and cons. I would say the benefit for crypto mining being that the profit can be more or less realized in real time, right? So as long as an attacker persists in an environment undetected, which isn't always that long, especially if they're noisy or if they conspicuously consume resources, which is often the case. And on the IAB side, it might take longer for an attacker to realize that profit, or as long as it takes them to find a buyer. However, in my opinion, this is a more risk-averse approach because they aren't really doing anything in the environment after they've gained access. And it doesn't really matter how long their customer has access to that cloud environment either. So they're simply selling the access keys and the access to that environment, and then they're done. But as long as crypto mining remains lucrative, and I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be in the near term or going into 2022, given the overall cryptocurrency market, it's probably safe to say that we'll see a continuation of the existing cryptojacking techniques and possibly vectors involving more novel techniques, such as what we saw with some supply chain attacks last year and this year. And similarly, we can probably expect more of the IAB activities because they, of course, can enable the crypto mining as well as any other type of activity that you would see in the cloud.
You're right on. So two things really jumped out at me there. The first is how you phrase that, the direct and indirect profit. And I think that's a really important point to make, is that for some cyber crimes, like something like ransomware, there's a step of that criminal, securing that data and then having to sell it back, to ransom it back in order to make the money, right? Or then sell it in the underground. Whereas with cryptojacking, it seems like that's a direct, as soon as that stood up and starts mining, they're making money, right? There's no wait for it. So it's That ties to the second thing that I thought was really, really interesting there as far as how noisy they are. So it seems like they'd have to figure out a strategy, right? Like, do I go big and try to mine as much as I can, as fast as I can, or I do go kind of low and slow? Do you have any research or any points that sort of indicate, like, are some groups better than that at others? Is there a predominant technique where they go for just as much as fast as they can?
We do see both. So when the attacker is configuring their miner, they can specify the percentage of CPU that they would like to consume for that malware or for that miner. And I would say it's probably about 50-50. About half of them are really noisy. They'll consume, a large portion of the CPU, where others try to fly under the radar somewhat. And they're the ones that usually can persist longer in the cloud environment.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's sort of the appetite for, how confident is a criminal that they can pop somebody else and start mining somewhere else if they get caught,
Exactly.
versus, what's their campaign goal, and all the normal sort of decisions that we make in a positive way for different things, they're making from this negative. So the one thing I did want to call out while we're on the topic is you mentioned IAB, or initial access brokers, a couple times. And I know the team had a really phenomenal blog post on that a couple months back. So if you check lacework.com/blog, and that actually popped up in the volume 2, I think, of the Cloud Threat Report as well. That's an absolutely critical thing for everybody in the audience to be checking out. And the reason being is that, unlike traditional on-premises environments where when access was being sold, it was an implant or compromised credentials to get in, not as often, but some way to get a foothold in the network. With the cloud, we all access it the same kind of way. If you have the access keys and secret key or credentials to the cloud provider, you're making the call directly to the cloud provider's APIs. And that's what they're selling, is that type of access, which means they're going to be able to have that same level of access. And that's the disadvantage of having everything programmatically accessible, is that when that access is compromised, then the bad guys have programmatic access to your environment as well. And that really highlights the need for observability to monitor all the data and the behaviors from that data, so that you can spot these abnormalities and anomalous activities. Gentlemen, this is the fantastic stuff. I believe the team collaborated and has some more meat on this and some links out in a blog post that just went up as well on the predictions. Greg, that's true? That's correct?
That's correct. The blog is up and goes into a little more detail on kind of everything we covered today.
Fantastic. Good. So absolutely, everybody, will drop the link to that in the chat. You should absolutely be checking that out. With that, I want to thank our guests, Chris Hall and Greg Foss, two of our fantastic researchers on our Lacework Labs team. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today. Really appreciate the insights.
Thanks for having us, Mark.